beneath the fading glow of a Nevada sunset, Clara Mae, a widow hardened by loss, served supper in her creaking Dust Haven diner, haunted by memories of a husband lost to a mind's fiery collapse. When a stranger named Hale steps through her door, his weary eyes and golden coin spark both suspicion and a flicker of hope. What secrets does he carry? And can one man's hidden truth reignite a town on the brink of ruin? The answer lies in a tale of betrayal, redemption, and a fragile new dawn. Subscribe now, share where you're listening from, and uncover whether Clara's heart will mend or break anew. Will you stay until the final sunset? The sun bled gold across the jagged Nevada skyline, sinking behind the skeletal ridges that cradled Dust Haven like a forgotten promise. Dust swirled in the evening wind, gritty and relentless, carrying the sharp tang of sweat and scorched sagebrush. The town's wooden signs groaned, their faded letters barely spelling out a place that time had half erased. In the heart of this dying speck of civilization stood Clara Mae's diner, its warped planks creaking under the weight of years and stubborn hope. Inside, Clara moved with the quiet precision of a woman who'd learned to outlast grief. Her hands, rough from work and winters, swept a rag across the counter, polishing scars left by miners' knives and spilled dreams. 2 years had passed since the mine fire stole her husband, Tom, leaving her with nothing but ash and a diner that barely paid its keep. She wore a faded calico dress, its blue threads worn thin, and her chestnut hair was pinned back, a few strands clinging to her sweat-damp neck. Her face, still sharp with beauty, carried lines etched by loss, lines that told of nights spent staring at a ceiling that offered no answers. The chalkboard behind her read, "Beef soup, 25 CU. Coffee's hot." No one had come since noon. Dust Haven wasn't a place for lingering anymore. Clara reached for the kerosene lamp, ready to snuff out the day, when the door's rusted hinges squealed. Boots thudded on the porch, heavy but measured, like a man who knew the sound of his own arrival. She froze, her hand hovering over the wick. Strangers at sundown weren't common, and those who came rarely brought good news. The door swung open, and he stepped in, a tall figure cloaked in a duster the color of dried mud, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over a face weathered by more than just the road. He looked to be in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with a lean strength that didn't boast. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, scanned the room before settling on her. "Evening, ma'am," he said, voice low and gravel rough, but polite enough to ease her grip on the rag. "Didn't mean to catch you closing. Saw the light. Wondering if a man could get a bowl of something warm before the night turns mean." Clara studied him, her instincts sharp as a blade. He didn't carry the twitchy edge of a drifter looking for trouble. But there was something, a weight in his step, a flicker in his gaze, that didn't fit Dust Haven's broken rhythm. Last spring, a man with a rusted pistol had tried to rob her, his hands shaking worse than hers. She'd stared him down until he fled. This stranger didn't look like that, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You're late," she said, voice flat but not unkind. "Was about to lock up. Soup's still on the stove, though. Coffee, too, if you don't mind it strong." He tipped his hat slightly, revealing dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. "Obliged, ma'am. Won't keep you long." He moved to a table by the window, his spurs jingling faintly, and sat with a quiet that felt practiced, like a man used to slipping through places unnoticed. Clara ladled a steaming bowl of beef soup, thick with barley and carrots, and set it down with a slab of cornbread, its crust cracked like desert earth. The coffee she poured sent up curls of steam, dark as the night creeping in. She didn't linger, retreating to the counter to wipe down a glass that didn't need it. but she watched him from the corner of her eye. His hands, calloused and steady, held the spoon like they'd known hard labor, not just a saddle. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, his gaze drifting to the empty street outside where the last light bled away. "You passing through?" she asked, breaking the silence, her voice cutting through the hum of the wind. He paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "For now," he said, not looking up. "Name's Hale, Mr. Hale." Clara nodded, filing the name away. Didn't sound like a lie, but it didn't sound like the whole truth either. She'd learned to spot men who carried secrets. They moved like they were dodging their own shadows. "Clara Mae," she offered, keeping it short. "Folks call me Clara." He glanced at her then, his eyes catching the lamplight. "Pleasure, Miss Clara. Fine place you got here." His tone was warm, but not soft, like a fire banked low. She didn't reply, just kept wiping the counter, though her hands slowed. When he finished, he pulled a coin pouch from his coat, the clink of metal louder than a drifter's ought to be. He slid a gold dollar across the table, far too much for soup and coffee. Clara's brow arched, but she said nothing, dropping the coin into the till. It landed with a weight that echoed in her chest. "Boarding house is down the street," she said, turning down the lamp. "If you need a bed." He stood, tugging his hat low. "Much obliged." His boots echoed on the warped floorboards as he stepped out, the door creaking shut behind him. Clara stood still, the diner's quiet settling like dust. Something about Hale lingered, not in his words, but in the air he left behind, a stir of unease, curiosity, and something she hadn't felt in years. Outside, the desert swallowed the last of the sun, and Dust Haven sank into shadow. But Clara knew, as she locked the door, that this stranger's story was far from over. The desert night had swallowed Dust Haven whole, leaving only the faint glow of Clara Mae's diner to push back the dark. She stood by the locked door, the gold dollar's weight still heavy in her mind, like a stone dropped in a dry well. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the stranger's departure into the vast, empty silence. Clara turned down the lamp, her shadow stretching long across the floorboards, and wondered if Hale would vanish like most drifters, chasing the next horizon. But something in his eyes, storm gray, guarded, told her he wasn't done with this town. By noon the next day, the sun scorched the earth, baking the streets into a haze of heat and dust. Clara worked the diner alone, her hands moving through the rhythm of chores, scrubbing pots, refilling salt shakers, wiping sweat from her brow. The air smelled of stale coffee and grease, undercut by the faint bite of creosote from the desert beyond. A few miners shuffled in, their faces caked with dirt, muttering about low yields and company quotas. Clara served them soup, her words clipped, her thoughts drifting to the stranger's coin. Dust Haven didn't see gold dollars often, not from men who looked like they'd slept under the stars. As the afternoon waned, the diner emptied, leaving only the creak of the ceiling fan and the distant bark of a coyote. Clara was sweeping the floor, her broom kicking up clouds of dust, when the door slammed open with a force that rattled the hinges. A man staggered in, reeking of whiskey and trouble. His name was Jed Harper, a cattle hand turned drunk, his face red as raw beef, eyes wild with liquor. "Clara Mae," he slurred, leaning against a table, knocking over a chair. "You got my supper or what? Ain't waitin' all damn day." Clara gripped the broom, her jaw tight. "Jed, you're drunk. Go sleep it off. I ain't serving you like this." Her voice was steel, honed from years of dealing with men who thought volume meant authority. Jed lurched forward, his hand grabbing for her arm. "You don't tell me what to do, woman." His breath was sour, his fingers bruising. Clara yanked free, raising the broom like a weapon, But before she could swing, a shadow filled the doorway. Hale stepped in, his duster flapping like a vulture's wings, his presence sucking the air from the room. "Let her be," he said, voice low, sharp as a blade drawn slow. Jed turned, swaying, his hand twitching toward the revolver at his hip. "Who the hell are you?" he spat, squinting at Hale. "Some saddle tramp thinking he's tough?" Hale didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his boots deliberate on the creaking floor. "Walk away, friend, or you'll crawl." His eyes locked on Jed's, unyielding, like a storm cloud ready to break. The room went still, the air thick with the promise of violence. Jed's hand hovered, then dropped. He muttered a curse, stumbled backward, and barreled out the door, leaving it swinging in his wake. Clara lowered the broom, her pulse hammering. "Didn't need saving," she said, though her voice shook just enough to betray her. "Didn't save you," Hale replied, brushing dust from his hat. "Just didn't like his manners." He moved to the same table as the night before, the one by the window, and sat as if nothing had happened. "Soup still good?" Clara stared, then let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She nodded, moving to the stove, ladling soup into a bowl. The cornbread she set beside it was fresh, its edges crisp as the desert's horizon. She poured coffee, black and steaming, and placed it before him. This time, she didn't retreat to the counter. She sat across from him, her own mug in hand, the silence between them heavy but not unkind. "You didn't leave town," she said, studying him over the rim of her cup. "Most do by first light." Hale stirred his soup, his spoon scraping the bowl. "Some places got a way of holding you." He looked up, his gaze steady but guarded, like a man who'd seen too many roads end in regret. "You been running this place alone long?" Clara's fingers tightened around her mug. 2 years. Since the mine fire took Tom. The words came out flat, but they carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. She didn't say more, and he didn't ask. Instead, he ate, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was tasting more than the soup, maybe the moment itself. They sat in quiet, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the street in shades of amber and rust. Clara watched him, noting the calluses on his knuckles, the faint scar above his brow. He didn't belong here, not in Dust Haven's broken sprawl, but he wasn't running either. When he finished, he slid another gold dollar across the table. Clara's eyes narrowed. "You keep paying like that, I'll start thinking you own the bank," she said, her tone dry as the desert. Hale's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Just believe in paying for good company." He stood, tipped his hat, and stepped out into the fading light. Clara watched him go, the door creaking shut, the coin glinting in her hand. She didn't know what Hale was running from or toward, but she felt the stir of something dangerous, not in him, but in the way her heart hadn't quickened like this since Tom. The desert night closed in, and Dust Haven held its breath, waiting for what came next. The desert night sealed Dust Haven in its grip, the wind carrying Hale's parting words like dust across a barren plain. Clara stood behind the counter, the gold dollar cold in her palm, its gleam a quiet accusation. Her heart stirred with a dangerous current, one she hadn't felt since Tom's laughter filled the diner. She shoved the coin into the till, its clink swallowed by the silence, and tried to shake the stranger from her thoughts. But Hale's shadow lingered, heavy as the storm brewing beyond the mountains. The next evening, the diner hummed with the low murmur of locals, miners with coal-streaked faces, a shopkeep nursing a chipped mug, and a pair of ranch hands swapping tales of lost cattle. The air was thick with the smell of beef soup and wood smoke, the kerosene lamps casting a warm, flickering glow. Clara moved between tables, her steps sure but her mind elsewhere, replaying Hale's quiet defense of her the day before. She was wiping down a table when the door creaked open, and Hale stepped in, his duster brushed clean, hat low over his eyes. He nodded to her, taking his usual seat by the window, where the fading light carved sharp angles across his face. She served him without a word, setting down a bowl of soup and a steaming mug of coffee. Their eyes met briefly, a silent understanding passing between them, like a rope pulled taut, but not yet knotted. Clara turned away, busying herself with a stack of plates, when the door slammed open again. The room fell quiet as Amos Tate, a wiry prospector with a beard like tangled wire, staggered in from the saloon across the street. His eyes were glassy, his voice loud enough to rattle the windows. "Clara Mae, you got a damn kingpin in your diner," he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at Hale. Every head turned. Hale froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth, his jaw tightening like a coiled spring. Clara stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Amos, you're drunker than a skunk in a whiskey barrel. Sit down or get out." Amos ignored her, swaying as he jabbed his finger toward Hale. "I know you, mister. Seen you in Carson City, about a year back, at some fancy land auction. Elias Hale Sinclair, big shot with half of Nevada in his pocket." The name landed like a gunshot, splintering the diner's fragile calm. Whispers rippled through the room, forks clattering against plates. Clara's breath caught, her hand gripping the counter's edge. Sinclair. The name was a curse in Dust Haven, tied to the mine fire that took Tom and 5 others, a blaze sparked by cost-cutting orders from a man who never dirtied his boots. Hale set his spoon down, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on the table. "You're mistaken," he said, voice low. But the words lacked conviction, like a man caught in a lie he'd hoped to outrun. "Mistaken?" Amos laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "I'd know that face anywhere. You signed the papers that burned this town to ash. You're the reason Clara's alone." The accusation hung in the air, heavy as smoke. The other patrons stared, some with anger, others with curiosity, their eyes boring into Hale like nails. Clara's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she stepped toward him. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice a blade, sharp and cold. "Are you Sinclair?" Hale looked up, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers, stripped of their guarded calm. He didn't answer right away, and that silence was answer enough. "Clara," he started, voice rough, but she cut him off. "Don't." Her word was a whip crack. "You sat here, ate my food, listened to me talk about Tom, knowing your name was on the orders that killed him?" Her voice broke, not with tears, but with rage, raw and jagged as the desert cliffs. The diner was deathly still, the air thick with the weight of betrayal. Hale stood, his chair scraping the floor. "I didn't know it was him," he said, quieter now, each word heavy with something that wasn't quite regret, but close. "Not until you spoke his name." "You knew enough to hide yours," Clara spat, her eyes burning. "Get out. Now." He didn't argue. He grabbed his hat, his movement slow, like a man carrying a wound. The patrons parted as he walked to the door, their stares a mix of scorn and fear. The door swung shut behind him, its creak echoing in the silence. Clara stood rooted, her chest heaving, the gold dollar's weight now a brand in her memory. She'd trusted him, shared her pain, and he'd carried the sin of her loss in his pocket all along. Outside, the night was black as coal, the wind howling like a warning. Clara turned to the counter, her hands shaking as she gripped a rag, wiping at nothing. The patrons resumed their meals, their whispers a low hum. But the diner felt colder now, its warmth snuffed out. Clara's heart was a storm of fury and hurt, but beneath it, a question gnawed. What was a man like Sinclair doing in Dusthaven, eating her soup, chasing ghosts? The answer, she feared, would break more than just her trust. The night's chill clung to Dusthaven, wrapping Clara Mae's diner in a shroud of silence, broken only by the wind's low moan. She stood alone, the rag in her hand forgotten, her thoughts a tangle of betrayal and unanswered questions. Hale's true name, Elias Hale Sinclair, burned in her mind, a wound as raw as the day the mine took Tom. What did a man like that want in her diner, sharing her silences? The answer lay somewhere in the desert's dark heart, and Clara wasn't sure she wanted to find it. By midday, the sun hammered the town, turning the streets into a furnace of dust and despair. Clara worked through the heat, her hand steady despite the storm in her chest. The diner was quiet, its tables empty save for a lone prospector nursing a cold coffee. The air smelled of burnt grease, and the faint, bitter tang of sagebrush carried on the breeze. Clara was scrubbing a pot, her knuckles white, when the door rattled with a force that wasn't the wind. 3 men strode in, their boots heavy, their faces hard as the cracked earth outside. They wore dust-caked jackets and carried the swagger of hired muscle. The leader, a broad man with a scar slicing his cheek, tipped his hat with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Clara Mae," he drawled, his voice oily as a snake's hiss. "Barrett Crow sends his regards. Says you're behind on that loan. Time's ticking." Clara set the pot down, her spine stiff as iron. "I know the terms," she said, her voice steady despite the pulse hammering in her throat. 30 days. I've got time." The man chuckled, a sound like gravel underfoot. "Crow ain't patient. Wants this place signed over, or we'll take it apart plank by plank." He leaned closer, his breath sour with tobacco. "You don't want trouble, do you?" Before Clara could answer, the door creaked again, and Hale stepped in, his duster swaying like a storm cloud. His eyes, gray and sharp, took in the scene in a heartbeat. "Trouble's already here," he said, voice low, cutting through the tension like a blade through leather. The 3 men turned, hands twitching toward their holsters, but Hale's presence was a wall, unyielding, calm, and dangerous. "Walk away," Hale said, stepping closer, his boots deliberate on the warped floor. "Or you'll be carried out." The scarred man sneered, his hand hovering over his gun. "You're that drifter from yesterday. Think you're some hero?" He glanced at his men, who spread out, their eyes glinting with menace. Clara gripped the counter, her heart pounding, but she didn't move. She'd faced worse than this, but not with a man like Hale in the room. The fight was quick and brutal. Hale moved like a man who'd learned violence in places harder than Dusthaven. He ducked a wild swing, grabbed the scarred man's wrist, and twisted until a crack echoed. The man howled, his gun clattering to the floor. The other 2 rushed him, but Hale was faster, landing a fist that sent one sprawling into a table, splintering it. The third caught a boot to the gut, collapsing with a wheeze. In moments, they were scrambling out the door, cursing and limping into the blazing sun. Clara exhaled, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You didn't have to do that," she said, though the words lacked conviction. Hale's gaze met hers, unreadable, and for a moment, she saw not Sinclair, but the man who'd sat at her table, sharing her quiet. "Didn't do it for thanks," he said, brushing blood from his knuckles. "Just don't like seeing good people cornered." He paused, then added, "You're keeping this place alive, Clara. That's worth something. If you're moved by stories of folks fighting for what's theirs, consider subscribing to hear more. Share where you're listening from. It keeps this tale burning." Clara's eyes narrowed, the sting of his true identity still fresh. "Don't think this changes anything," she said, her voice cold as the desert night. "You're still Sinclair." He nodded, not arguing, and took his seat by the window. She served him soup, her movements mechanical, the silence between them heavier now. Outside, the town stirred, word of the fight spreading like wildfire. Miners and shopkeepers began to glance at Hale differently, their whispers carrying respect, not scorn. Clara saw it, felt it, but her heart was a locked door. Crow's men would be back, and 30 days wasn't long. She glanced at Hale, his head bowed over his bowl, and wondered what kind of man could carry both a savior's hands and a sinner's name. The sun sank lower, painting Dust Haven in blood-red light, and Clara knew the real fight was just beginning. The sun bled red across Dust Haven, its dying light casting long shadows over a town bracing for battle. Clara Mae stood behind her counter, the memory of Hale's bloodied knuckles and her own locked heart weighing heavily. Crow's men hadn't returned, but their threat hung like smoke, and 30 days were shrinking fast. She scrubbed a glass, her hands moving on instinct, but her eyes kept drifting to the empty street, half expecting Hale's shadow to darken her door again. The fight had shifted something in Dust Haven. Whispers of his name now carried respect, not just fear. But Clara's trust remained buried under the ash of Tom's grave. 3 days later, the town square buzzed with tension, and a crowd gathered under a sky bruised purple by dusk. Barrett Crow, the bank's snake-eyed master, stood on a makeshift platform, his polished boots gleaming against the rough-hewn wood. Behind him, a table held stacks of deeds, Dust Haven's lifeblood, ready to be sold to the highest bidder. Townsfolk stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces carved with worry. Miners, shopkeepers, widows, all clutching what little hope they had left. Clara stood at the edge, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. The diner's deed was among those papers, her life's work dangling by a thread. Crow raised a hand, his voice smooth as oil. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dust Haven's future lies here." He tapped the deeds, his smile sharp as a razor. "Bidding starts at sundown. Pay up or lose what's yours." The crowd murmured, anger simmering but held back by fear. Crow's men flanked the platform, their revolvers glinting, a silent promise of trouble for anyone who stepped out of line. Clara's fingers dug into her arms, her eyes scanning the crowd for a way out. She'd scraped together every cent, but it wasn't enough. Not for Crow's greed. The air grew thick, the sun sinking lower, when a ripple passed through the crowd. Heads turned, voices hushed. Hale strode forward, his duster flapping like a raven's wings, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His face was unreadable, but his steps were deliberate, cutting through the dust like a blade through hide. Clara's breath caught, her heart torn between fury and something she refused to name. Crow's eyes narrowed. "You again," he sneered. "Got no business here, drifter." Hale stopped at the platform's edge, his gaze steady as stone. "Name's not Drifter. It's Elias Hale Sinclair." The crowd gasped, the name a spark in dry grass. Whispers spread. Sinclair, the man who owned the mine, the man whose orders burned lives to cinders. Clara's hands clenched, her chest tight with the betrayal still raw. Hale didn't look at her, his focus locked on Crow. He dropped the satchel on the table with a heavy thud, the sound echoing like a gavel. "Every deed on this table," Hale said, voice low but carrying to the back of the crowd, "is paid in full. Every debt wiped clean." He opened the satchel, revealing stacks of gold coins and signed papers, releases, titles, notarized and final. "These belong to Dust Haven's people, not you." The crowd erupted, voices rising in shock and disbelief. Crow's face twisted, his hand twitching toward his gun. "You can't do this," he spat. "This is my land, my bank." Hale stepped closer, his presence a storm held in check. "Check the signatures. They're legal. You're done here." He turned to the crowd, his eyes sweeping over faces now alight with hope. "Take your deeds. They're yours." A woman, old widow Grayson, pushed forward, her hands trembling as she grabbed a paper with her name. Others followed, a tide of hands reaching for what was rightfully theirs. Clara stood frozen, her diner's deed among them, but she didn't move. Her eyes were on Hale, searching for the man who'd hidden his name, who'd carried her pain in silence. She wanted to hate him, but the sight of her neighbors clutching their futures made it harder to hold. Crow's men shifted, their hands on their guns, but the crowd's swell was a force of its own. A miner shouted, "We're done bowing to you, Crow." The banker's smirk faltered, his power crumbling like dry clay. Hale stood still, his face unreadable, but Clara saw the weight in his shoulders, the cost of a truth he couldn't outrun. She stepped forward, her boots crunching in the dust, and picked up her deed. Her fingers brushed the paper, but her eyes locked on Hale's, a storm of anger and questions unanswered. The sun sank below the horizon, bathing Dust Haven in twilight. Clara held her deed, her heart a battlefield, and knew this wasn't the end. Hale had given the town its life back, but the ghosts of his past, and hers, still walked the streets. The crowd dispersed, clutching their papers, but Clara lingered, the weight of Hale's actions heavier than the deed in her hand. Twilight draped Dust Haven in a veil of indigo, the air thick with the scent of dust and defiance. Clara Mae stood apart, her deed clutched tight, its ink a fragile shield against the ghosts of her past. Hale's actions had unshackled the town, but the weight of his name, Sinclair, still pressed against her ribs, a reminder of the fire that stole Tom. The crowd's cheers faded as they scattered, clutching their reclaimed futures, but Clara lingered, her eyes tracing the silhouette of Hale against the darkening sky. What kind of man undid his own empire? The question burned, unanswered, as the desert night crept closer. The town square, now nearly empty, buzzed with a different kind of tension. Barrett Crow stood on his platform, his face a mask of rage, the deeds he'd meant to sell now gone. His men, battered from their earlier run-in with Hale, hovered at his side, their hands itching for their guns. The crowd's defiance had shaken Crow, but his pride was a rattler, coiled and ready to strike. Clara watched from the shadows, her boots rooted in the dirt, as Hale turned to leave, his satchel empty, his shoulders squared, but heavy. "You think you've won?" Crow's voice cut through the dusk, sharp as a broken bottle. He stepped off the platform, his polished boots kicking up dust, his revolver glinting at his hip. "You don't walk into my town, Sinclair, and tear it apart like it's yours to break." Hale stopped, his back to Crow, his duster swaying in the evening breeze. "It was never yours," he said, voice low, steady as a stone in a riverbed. He turned slowly, his gray eyes catching the last light like steel. "You built nothing. You just fed off their sweat." Crow's lips curled, his hand dropping to his gun. Big talk for a man who burned half this town to ash. The words were a lash, meant to draw blood, and Clara flinched, her fingers tightening on the deed. The few townsfolk still lingering, Widow Grayson, a grizzled miner named Amos, a young ranch hand, froze, their eyes darting between the two men. Dust Haven held its breath, the air crackling with the promise of violence. Crow's men fanned out, their hands on their holsters, but Hale didn't move. "Put it down, Crow," he said, his voice a warning wrapped in calm. "This ends now, or it ends ugly." Crow laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling. "You don't scare me, Sinclair. You're just a rich man playing cowboy." He drew his revolver, the barrel gleaming under the rising moon. But before he could aim, a shout broke the silence. "Enough!" Amos, the miner, stepped forward, his pickaxe handle gripped tight. Widow Grayson followed, her frail frame trembling but defiant, a kitchen knife in her hand. The ranch hand joined them, his own gun drawn, not at Hale, but at Crow's men. "You lost, Crow," Amos growled. "These deeds are ours. You ain't taking 'em back." The crowd swelled, more townsfolk stepping into the square, shopkeepers, farmers, even the saloon's barkeep, their faces hard with a resolve forged in years of loss. Clara's heart pounded, her eyes wide. Dusthaven, broken and beaten, was rising. Crow's smirk faltered, his eyes flicking to the growing crowd. His men hesitated, their guns still drawn, but their confidence crumbling. Hale stepped forward, his presence a quiet storm. "They're done bowing," he said, his voice carrying over the square. "Walk away, or they'll bury you." Crow's hand shook, his revolver wavering. For a moment, it seemed he'd shoot, but the weight of the town's eyes, unyielding, unbroken, pressed harder than any bullet. He lowered his gun, his face twisting with fury. "This ain't over," he spat, but his voice cracked, hollow as a dry well. He turned, his men trailing like whipped dogs, and disappeared into the night, their boots echoing on the empty street. The crowd exhaled, their weapons lowering, but the air remained charged. Clara stepped forward, her deed still in hand, her gaze locked on Hale. He hadn't drawn a gun, hadn't raised a fist, yet he'd turned the tide. She wanted to hate him, to see only the man who'd signed Tom's death warrant, but the town's fire, rekindled by his hand, made it harder. Amos clapped Hale's shoulder, muttering thanks, but Hale only nodded, his eyes distant, like a man staring at a debt he couldn't pay. Clara approached, her boots crunching in the dust. "Why?" she asked, her voice low, sharp. "Why give it all up?" Hale met her gaze, his face etched with something raw, unguarded. "Because it was never mine to keep." He turned, walking toward the desert's edge, leaving Dusthaven to its newborn strength. Clara watched him go, the deed heavy in her hand, her heart caught between rage and the faint stir of something new, a spark that scared her more than Crow's gun. The desert swallowed Hale's figure as he walked into the night, leaving Dusthaven to breathe free for the first time in years. Clara Mae stood in the empty square, the deed to her diner, a cold weight in her hand, her heart a snarl of anger and reluctant awe. Hale had torn down Crow's empire without firing a shot, but his name, Sinclair, still echoed like a curse, tying him to Tom's grave. She turned toward her diner, the town's newfound strength a faint warmth against the chill of her distrust. What kind of man gave up power only to walk away? The question lingered, sharp as a thorn, as she locked the door behind her. Days passed, and Dusthaven stirred with life. Shopkeepers swept their porches with purpose. Miners shared drinks without glancing over their shoulders, and children ran through the streets, their laughter cutting through the dust. Clara kept the diner running, her hand steady, but her thoughts restless. She hadn't seen Hale since the auction, his absence a shadow that clung to her routine. The townsfolk whispered of him. Some called him a savior, others a ghost. But Clara kept silent, her heart locked tight against the man who'd both broken and rebuilt her world. On the 5th day, with the sun dipping low, painting the desert in shades of rust and amber, Clara found herself walking the old trail south of town. The path wound past sagebrush and crumbling fences, leading to the abandoned stage station Tom had dreamed of reviving. She carried a woven basket, its contents, biscuits, smoked ham, a tin of beans, wrapped in linen, an offering she hadn't planned but couldn't resist. The station's sagging roof and weathered beams came into view, and there was Hale, his shirt rolled to his elbows, hammering a brace into a rotting wall. His horse grazed nearby, tethered to a post he'd driven into the hard earth. Clara stopped, her boots scuffing the dirt. Hale looked up, his gray eyes catching hers, unguarded for a moment before they shuttered again. He set the hammer down, wiping sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. "Didn't expect company," he said, voice low, rough as the desert wind. "Didn't expect to come," Clara replied, her tone sharp but not cruel. She set the basket on a weathered crate, her movements deliberate, like a woman testing unsteady ground. "Food's still warm. Figured you might be hungry." Hale studied her, his face etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken debts. He nodded, stepping closer, but keeping his distance, as if sensing the storm still brewing in her. "Obliged," he said, lifting the basket's lid. The scent of biscuits and ham rose, mingling with the dry tang of creosote. He motioned to the crate. "Sit, if you're inclined." Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on her coat. She wanted to turn back, to keep the wall between them, but something in his quiet, his lack of excuses, held her. She sat, her boots dangling, and watched as he unpacked the meal. They ate in silence, the only sounds the creak of the station's timbers and the distant howl of a coyote. The sky burned red, then softened to purple, the desert stretching vast and unforgiving around them. "Why here?" Clara asked finally, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Why fix this place?" Hale chewed slowly, his gaze on the horizon. "Heard you talk about it. Tom's dream. Figured it deserved a chance." He didn't look at her, but his words carried a weight, heavy as the hammer at his side. Clara's jaw tightened, her fingers digging into the crate. "Don't say his name like you knew him," she said, her voice low, sharp. "You don't get to do that." Hale nodded, his eyes still on the desert. "Fair enough." He set his plate down, his hands resting on his knees, scarred and worn. "I'm not here to erase what I did. Just trying to build something that ain't mine to own." Clara studied him, the lines of his face, the way he carried his guilt like a saddle too heavy for the road. She wanted to hate him, to let the fire of her loss burn away any flicker of understanding. But the station's patched roof, the braced wall, the quiet effort of his hands, they spoke louder than his words. She stood, brushing crumbs from her coat, and looked at the station, its bones still strong despite the years. "This doesn't fix anything," she said, her voice steady but softer now. "But it's a start." Hale met her gaze, his eyes raw, like a man who'd stopped running from his shadow. "That's all I'm asking." He stood, picking up the hammer again, as the last light faded. Clara turned, walking back toward Dusthaven, the basket lighter, but her heart heavier. The desert night closed in, but the station's silhouette stood firm, a fragile promise against the dark. The stage station's silhouette stood stark against the desert night, its patched roof a quiet defiance of time's decay. Clara Mae walked back to Dusthaven, the empty basket swinging in her hand, her heart a tangle of grief and the faint pulse of something new. Hale's hammer strokes echoed in her mind, each one a step toward Tom's dream. Yet his name, Sinclair, still burned like a brand. She didn't look back, but the station's promise lingered, fragile as a spark in dry grass, daring her to believe in beginnings she'd long buried. Weeks passed, and Dusthaven bloomed under its newfound freedom. The saloon rang with laughter, not fear. The schoolhouse's bell chimed for the first time in years, and the general store's shelves groaned with fresh goods. Clara kept the diner open, her hand steady as she served miners and families alike, but her thoughts drifted south to the station. Word spread that Hale was still there, hauling timber, patching walls, his horse a constant shadow tethered to the post. Townsfolk spoke of him with cautious respect, but Clara stayed silent, her heart a locked gate, unsure if she could forgive a man whose past had taken so much. One crisp morning, with the desert air sharp and the sky a blaze of gold, Clara found herself on the trail again. She carried no basket this time, only a folded letter. Tom's last, written before the fire, its words of hope for a stage station worn thin from her touch. The path was dusted with frost, the first kiss of winter, and her boots crunched against the earth. The station emerged over a rise, its roof now braced, a new window frame catching the light. Hale stood on the porch, sawing a plank, his shirt stained with sweat, his gray eyes lifting as she approached. He set the saw down, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Didn't think you'd come back," he said, his voice rough but steady, like a river carving stone. Clara stopped at the porch's edge, her fingers tight on the letter. "Wasn't sure I would." She looked past him, at the station's sturdy bones, the fresh timber stacked against a wall. "This place, it's starting to look like his dream." Hale nodded, his gaze dropping to the letter in her hand. He had a good eye for what could be. He didn't say Tom's name, respecting her earlier rebuke, but his words carried a quiet weight, like a man offering a gift he wasn't sure would be taken. Clara unfolded the letter, her eyes tracing the familiar scrawl. He wrote this before the fire. Said this station could be a heart for Dust Haven, somewhere folks could rest, trade, build something. Her voice was low, steady, but it cracked on the last word. She looked at Hale, her eyes sharp. "You don't get to take his dream and make it yours." Hale's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Ain't trying to, just giving it a chance to breathe." He gestured to the station, its walls stronger now, a chimney pipe poking through the roof. "This belongs to you, Clara, always will." She stepped onto the porch, her boots echoing on the new planks. The air smelled of sawdust and frost, the desert stretching vast around them. She set the letter on a crate, its edges curling, and looked at Hale. "I don't forgive you," she said, her voice clear, unyielding. "But I see what you're doing, and I'm here." Hale's eyes softened, not with relief but with something deeper, like a man finding ground after years adrift. They stood in silence, the wind whispering through the sagebrush, the sun climbing higher, gilding the station in light. Clara walked the perimeter, her fingers brushing the braced walls, the new beams, each one a stitch in a wound she hadn't named. Hale followed at a distance, his hammer resting idle, his presence a quiet anchor. They sat eventually on crates by the porch, sharing no food but the space between them. Clara spoke first, her voice practical, grounded. "Needs a swing here, facing west. Storms come that way. Good to watch 'em roll in." Hale nodded, a faint smile tugging his mouth, the first she'd seen that wasn't shadowed by guilt. "Could use more horses," he said. "Folks'll need 'em when the stage starts running." They talked of lumber, of a barn to rebuild, of a bell to ring for travelers. No apologies, no promises, just plans, shared like stones laid for a foundation. The desert sun sank, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, and Dust Haven's heart beat stronger. Clara looked at Hale, his silhouette sharp against the sunset, and felt the fragile stir of a new beginning, not born of forgiveness, but of something harder won. Truth laid bare in the dust. The sun sets on Dust Haven, where Clara and Hale forge a fragile beginning from the ashes of loss and truth. Their story of redemption and resilience lingers, a testament to the West's unyielding spirit. What did their journey stir in you? Share your thoughts. Where are you listening from? And what moved you most? Your voices keep these tales alive, and I'm grateful for every moment you've spent here. Until the next sunset, when we'll ride again through stories of hearts rebuilt and promises kept, stay close to the fire. Dust Haven's light still burns, and I'll meet you on the trail for the next chapter.